press is into trivia, extravaganza, celebrity misdeeds, misbehavior. It's really crazy what's going on here. And, you know, how do you satire satire when the most serious news is a satire? You know, Jon Stewart.
The original consumer advocate, Ralph Nader, is also an author, an attorney, a lecturer, and a 4-time U.S. presidential candidate. He is the living embodiment of the committed man of the people. He's been the inspiration for generations of young political activists, and his fire still burns. We met him in Washington, D.C.
I wanted to ask you, Ralph, about your youth growing up in Connecticut and what it was about your family situation or whatever it was that was surrounded you in your youth that gave you the catalyst to go as fully into the kind of activism that you've been involved in all of your life.
Well, I think my parents had very good judgment in terms of what it took to educate children. And so we used to say we got trained in school, excited in the library, and educated at home. By that I mean we had a lot of conversations about local, national, international issues that were at the dinner table.
Yeah.
There was no TV, radio type distraction, and they used a friendly Socratic method just to nudge us along.
Really?
Yes, and it was so fertile actually that I put it together in a book called 17 Traditions, 17 Ways They Raised Us, starting with learning how to listen. And it's the most popular book I've ever written.
Is that right?
Because a lot of parents with young children really resonate to it. The other thing was, and it's not just I'm on Canadian TV, is that we had regular visits with my Canadian cousins. We would go to Toronto, we'd go up to Lake Simcoe or Couchiching.
I wanted to talk to you a little bit too about the work that you did when you were young that brought you to everybody's attention, and that was the writing that you did about car safety. I think you were probably 24 or 25 in 1959 when you wrote a piece for The Nation about car safety. And it was 5 or 6 years later that you wrote Unsafe at Any Speed, which has been cited as one of the 100 most important pieces of journalism of the 20th century, which is pretty impressive. But at the time, General Motors, they went to great and unscrupulous lengths to discredit you, didn't they, back then?
Yeah, they couldn't stand criticism because they were number one, they were making a lot of money. Who's to tell them what to do? They were very arrogant that way and very inbred, which of course led to the seeds of their demise years later, as we see now. They hired private detectives to follow me because I had published some articles indicating that the Corvair, for example, was unsafe in terms of its stability and other factors about a lot of other cars, namely the lack of seat belts, lack of rollover bars, side protection, collapsible steering wheels, all the things we take for granted now, which were not on cars. And so people would be killed in 15, 20-mile-an-hour collisions. Well, GM had not been used to this. There was no federal regulation of safety for autos, no state regulation to speak of. And so they hired private detectives, and they followed me down to the Senate a few days before I was to testify, which exposed them to interfering with a federal witness, which is a crime. And they were caught by the guards, the detectives were, and it traced all the way back to General Motors, and Senator Ribikoff had a widely publicized hearings. I remember it was really packed with media, and he hauled the head of General Motors, the general counsel, and the detective to explain themselves. Well, it created such an uproar that it led to the passage of the Motor Vehicle and Highway Safety Laws in 1966, which irregularly enforced have saved well over 1 million lives.
Were you aware that they were going out of their way to discredit you that way? In the way
I was aware I was being followed. Yeah.
What was that like? I mean, as a young man at the time doing this work, and my sense was that up until then you had been sort of a habitué of academe for the most part, and suddenly you're out there and you've got this giant corporation trying to smear you. I mean, they were trying to smear you.
Yes.
Was that the first big? Was it like welcome to the real world eye opener for you at the time?
Well, because I had studied litigation and products liability and the battles that lawyers had with GM's defective cars, I was pretty used to the rough and tumble.
Yeah.
So it didn't really surprise me. I didn't know who it was at first, But when a Detroit News reporter called up each one after the detectives were caught by the Capitol Hill police, and Chrysler said no, and Ford said no, and AMC said no, and GM said no comment. And that was beginning.
There was that one extra word.
Unraveling. And at that time, you could never get on TV talking about cars critically with brand names, identifying. That's why I had to go to Toronto for that This Week Has 7 Days program.
Yes.
And that was beamed over through Windsor to Detroit. And when I got back to Washington, I started getting calls. They broke the ice. Canada broke the ice.
That's very interesting. All right, let's talk about politics. You had kind of skirted around the edges of politics for a long time, leading up to '96, I guess, when you first actually then went into joined the fray. Why did you do that? Because a lot of people at the time, I remember thinking, and I was one of them, thought, well, why would he want to do this? You know, he seemed more effective out there. Why would he want to become one of these people?
Because the doors started closing in Washington, not just on our citizen groups, environmental, consumer, but any citizen groups that wanted to challenge big business. As the Democrats started collecting money big time around 1979 from corporate commercial interests. And that was the beginning of the increasing similarity between the two parties on the issues of corporate power, of regulation, of corporate accountability. And so, I stayed with it for a while, but all of us would, work harder and harder for less and less. We couldn't get congressional hearings. The courts began to be technistic because they were Nixon appointees and so forth. And the regulatory agencies were not being responsive. So after a while, you either say, well, what do we do? We'll close up shop and go to Malibu and watch the whales? Or do we go into the electoral arena, so try to draw some of the energy from the people to take back to Washington?
So the irony here, it seems to me, is that you say that you had better success at getting a number of pieces of legislation enacted and pushed through during the administrations of people like Richard Nixon than you did under an administration like Bill Clinton's. How come?
Because the corporations massively increased their control over Washington in explicit ways, like thousands of more lobbyists, political action committees proliferated like rabbits, pouring money into the coffers of senators, representatives, presidents, and they just, they start filling up the office buildings on K Street, so in Washington. So that's what happened. Nixon, at the beginning, signed a lot of the bills that we got through, the EPA, Environmental Protection Bill, the Occupational Safety Bill, the Product Safety Bill, because he was afraid of the rumble from the people coming out of the 60s. But then the rumble began to be dimmer and dimmer, and his successors, whether they're Democrat or Republican, with a few exceptions, part of Jimmy Carter's regulatory apparatus was okay, was closed. They just shut down.
Yeah. During the 2000 campaign, presidential campaign, you famously referred to Al Gore and George W. Bush as Tweedledum and Tweedledee. Now, in the cut and thrust of a campaign, people will say things that will catch attention, but I'm wondering if you actually believe that they were the same guy.
On corporate power, that's what I meant.
You believe that they were indistinguishable from one another?
On corporate power. Yeah. I mean, Gore was in the hands of the drug industry, for example, when he was vice president. He never spoke out against nuclear power. We couldn't even get him to make a speech on solar energy. It was almost hard even to get an appointment with him in the last 4 or 5 years of the Clinton administration. And they just were not good. They were not good on the coal industry. They gave the auto industry 8 years of their term with no fuel-efficient pollution control standards. And at the time, Bush, everybody thought Bush would be like his father, no worse, no better. So on corporate power. But, of course, the press always deleted the corporate power. I mean, obviously, Gore was more congenial to Social Security and Medicare than George W. Bush. But on the central issue of who's going to dominate our political economy, they were uncomfortably similar.
Well, given what you just said about Gore and his lack of, during the Clinton administration, his lack of action on some of these environmental issues, Do you look askance at him now as the poster boy for the global environmental movement?
He's born again. I stood in line waiting to have his book signed because I wanted to speak to him when he came
You stood in line?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
There were 300 people in a Washington, D.C. bookstore. And,
you mean some aide somewhere of his didn't look down the line and say, wait a minute, Ralph?
I think they knew I was getting closer to him. He was very cordial. He wrote very nice inscription. He's never blamed the Green Party. It was stolen from him in Florida.
But are you?
And the important thing was, he was free. In fact, when I came up to him for the signature, I said, "How's it feel to be free?" And he said, "Really good." Because because he was free, and some people in Hollywood gave him a big lift, he became a major advocate on climate change.
So you're buying the conversion then, is what you're saying? You think that the scales fell from his eyes? And
well, why wouldn't it be? I mean, he gets a Nobel Prize, he gets $100,000 a lecture. I mean, what's there to switch?
Not to like?
What's there not to like?
All right. Okay. All right. Let's talk about that 2000 election because you made a reference to it there a second ago. You've never bought the arguments that it was your staying in that cost Gore that election.
No, because it's before election days, the dynamics you want to look at, and by pushing Gore modestly to take more critical statements on drug companies, insurance companies, oil companies in his speeches, he actually got more votes than he would have got had I not been in the race. And there are social scientists who've studied those dynamics before Election Day that concluded that. And the other thing, of course, was that he won the popular vote. In most countries, right, when you come in first, you usually win. But because of our antiquated electoral college, you can come in second in the presidential race, but if you win the electoral votes, you win. And then, of course, Florida, and books have been written on how it was stolen from Tallahassee all the way to that political decision in the Supreme Court, which prohibited the Florida Supreme Court from finishing the recount.
Yeah. You're obviously aware, though, of the depth of the vehemence against you by a number of people who still to this day believe that it was your fault.
Well,
there was a backlash out there.
They're desperately seeking scapegoats. They don't want to look at themselves in a mirror and ask, how come a vice president of the United States couldn't landslide a bumbling governor from Texas with a horrible record?
Just to show you and I'm not sure you're aware of this or not, but just to show you how it sort of permeated the culture, John Irving, the author, has a new book out called Last Night in Twisted River, in which there is a kind of Yosemite Sam-like character, an old logger with heavy opinions on everything, who at one point in the book, and I want to read this to you, his name is Ketchum, this character. He sends a fax to one of the principal figures in the book that says, "Where are the assassins when you want one?" Ketchum had faxed. He didn't mean George W. Bush. Ketchum meant that someone should have killed Ralph Nader. Gore would have beat Bush in Florida if Nader hadn't played the spoiler role. Ketchum believed that Ralph Nader should be bound and gagged, preferably in a child's defective car seat, and sunk in the Androscoggin. Well, this is in a novel now, so it's reached the point where it's into the
Well, I know John Irving, he should be ashamed of himself to say that even in a novel. But the important thing to remember is there's a lot of political bigotry in the United States against third-party independent candidates.
Yes.
Because they've had it their way, the two parties. It's a two-party tyranny. I mean, my campaign manager, Teresa Amato, just finished a book titled Grand Illusion, The Myth of Voter Choice in a Two-Party Tyranny. And so they can't stand to be challenged. But the Republicans aren't as bad as the Democrats, because the Democrats really cannot be challenged, stand to be challenged from the progressive side. And that is deep in the liberal intelligentsia that spends 3 out of 4 years criticizing the Democrats, and then in the fourth year they say, oh no, you can't criticize them because the Republicans are worse, which of course doesn't pull on the John Kerry or Obama in the direction of progressives, because they give them a year off. They don't make any demands on them. So we're starting a real major movement to break down the barriers so voters have more choices on the ballot. I mean, in our country, they gerrymander districts, Republicans, Democrats, so they really don't even have a major party opposing them. It's either a slam-dunk Republican district for the House of Representatives or a slam-dunk Democrat. So over 90% of the members of the House of Representatives are automatically reelected, unless they want to run for the Senate or resign.
In 2004, when you decided to jump back into it again,
my
understanding is that you got together with John Kerry, and there was a little bit of bargaining that was going on there, but ultimately he let you down, didn't he?
He did, because I told him very clearly, look, let's go after Bush together. You can't say certain things about Bush that I can. And on issues of corporate crime and labor reform and criticizing corporate welfare, subsidies, handouts, you can really make a dent in the Republican, the more liberal Republican base. And he didn't buy it. He relied too much on his consultants.
I've often wondered why Kerry would approach you and then back away from it so quickly. I mean, he must have known what sorts of things you would be looking for. Why do you think he would make the initial kind of probing offer and then just ignore you?
It wasn't much of an offer. It's just I knew him right when he came back from Vietnam as a young man.
Right.
He came to see me, so I've known him. And he had dinner with me and told me he was going to run against Bush in 1999, for example. So when I called him for a meeting, he said, "Well, yeah, why not?" But we gave him all our criticisms, all our materials on Bush, on the Republican Party, and they were very cautious, and they paid the price.
Yeah.
I mean, they should have easily won in 2004. Bush wasn't doing well in Iraq. Well, he was destroying it, but he was down in the polls.
Yeah. During that same campaign, I had read somewhere that the chair of the Democratic National Committee, who I think is Terry McAuliffe, right, that he tried to bribe you not to run campaigns in certain areas. Is that true?
Well, he did call. I had a telephone call with him in the spring of 2000, where he basically said, "If you stay out of the closed states, Ralph, I'll raise money for you in all the other states." And it was quite clear. We took notes. But that's the way he operates. That's the way these politicians operate. And that was just when they were starting to throw 24 lawsuits against us in 18 states in just 12 weeks in 2000. To get us off the ballot.
So the implication there was, we'll get rid of all of these lawsuits we'll sweeten it with this. That was the deal?
That was before the lawsuits were starting.
All right.
So the implication was, if I played ball, if I just went into the slam dunk states like Texas, which is was going to be Bush, New York, which is in Massachusetts, going to be Kerry, a state out of Ohio and Pennsylvania. Canadians have trouble, I'm sure, trying to understand the mystical nature of this two-party tyranny.
It's kind of fun, though.
That he would raise funds for me. That's pretty inappropriate.
Now, ultimately, he became one of the critics of you afterwards when you took money from some rich Republicans, right? Then they said you should be giving it back, and you said no.
Well, the Democrats took 15 times more. I mean, when checks come in, you don't say, "Oh, is this a Republican or is this a Democrat?" You don't start seeing whether they did something in their opinion that was different than what you believe in. As long as there's no strings attached, as there are legal contributions. Yeah. But the Democrats raised millions of dollars from registered Republicans. We were raising money from anybody who could legally give it to us.
What about 2008? What about the 2008 campaign? Why did you do it again for a third time?
Because I think voters need to always have a choice, including the progressive agenda, which is basically an agenda that devolves power to people and subordinates corporate power to the sovereignty of the people.
Because you certainly came under a lot of criticism for going into it for a third time.
Well, you always will in the United States, because how dare you challenge these two parties? Don't you know that they own all the voters? I mean, no, they don't own all the voters. And in the 19th century, it's good enough voters went for the Liberty Anti-Slavery Party and the Women's Suffrage Party and the Labor Farmer Reform parties. We now say, oh, isn't it nice that they swung away from the Whigs and the Republicans and the Democrat parties and voted for these little parties who set the agenda for the next 100 years. We haven't learned that lesson again in the 21st century. They're still at it. Least worst voting, stay away.
A guy named Mark Cooper, writing on the Huffington Post during that campaign, actually probably in the spring of 2008, wrote something that I thought was interesting, and I wanted to get you to react to this. He said, Ralph Nader could play an essential and productive role between now and November without sacrificing neither his independence or his principles. One could imagine a rolling coast-to-coast Chautauqua over this coming summer, during which Nader precisely would keep alive any and all of the issues neglected by the mainstream debate. It could be a role of great import and great dignity. Why Nader has instead chosen to further marginalize himself and his agenda is way beyond me.
And, of course, he agrees with my agenda. And, of course, they all turn into a least worst frenzy of fear and don't make demands on the Democratic presidential nominee, therefore allowing the Democratic presidential nominee to move more to the right and more to the corporate side, which is pulling him 24/7. We tried that, what he suggested. We went all over the country. We did what he said we would do. The press didn't pay any attention to it. The Democrats wouldn't give us the time of day. I mean, we had issues that would have helped Dukakis, and they wouldn't give us the time of day. Unless you're inside the electoral arena, that's the only way they pay attention to you.
And you don't think that it's any better now than it was back then in '84? It would have been.
No.
You suspected it would be probably worse now.
Oh yeah, well it's a tough nut to crack. But if you're not inside the electoral arena, keeping the flame alive, going with young people, teaching them clean politics, disseminating the progressive agenda on living wage and health insurance and corporate crime crackdown and tax reform and stop militarizing our foreign policy, et cetera, et cetera. After a while, every 4 years, these issues will disappear.
You have said, and before I want to move to the book in a second, but I just want to ask you this finally. Then you have said that you don't think the kind of change that you and all of your supporters managed in the past could happen again. Now, you've answered that in part so far by talking about the strangulation that you see by the corporate world on the political system. But is there a possibility, do you think, that there could be a resurgence of the rumble that you talked about earlier? And if so, where would it have to come from?
Well, obviously it has to come from the voters back home. Washington is like corporate occupied territory, and the White House like a corporate prison. I mean, you just got to try to work the city to sense what I'm talking about. The important thing is that people have got to develop a civic self-confidence, say, hey, we're losing our country. We're in a recession, massive unemployment, underemployment. 45,000 people die every year because they can't get health insurance to treat themselves. 47 million people without health insurance, including children. And, 1 out of every 3 workers, Walmart wages $7.5, $8, $9, $10 an hour. Pensions crashing. I mean, this is serious problems. And so you have to build democracy. In Canada, you have someone who has exactly the answer to the question you're talking about, the Democracy Watch by Duff Conacher in Ottawa. I mean, he really understands what it takes to build the instruments and the facilities and tools of democracy. And that's what we have to focus on. But, the press is into trivia, extravaganza, celebrity misdeeds, misbehavior.
Yes.
It's really crazy what's going on here. How do you satire satire?
Yeah.
When the most serious news is a satire, Jon Stewart.
Yes.
That's what young people look at.
Yeah. Now, okay, so this brings us to the book, because in a sense, it's almost like you have decided that you're going to use another vehicle to try and bring this home. And so you write this piece of fiction, which is not a novel, as you've said many times, Practical Utopia, you've called it, weighs in pretty heavy at 736 pages.
Large print.
Well, it's not that large. But I have to ask you just the practical questions. When the hell did you start writing this, and where do you find the time? Where did you pry out the time to write something this long?
It's pretty easy, actually. Taken all together, if you compressed it, it'd be 9 months I wrote it.
Really?
Yeah, because, when you're in Washington, you don't win all the time. And when you lose, you say in your mind, what if we had more organizers? What if we had more media for our issues? What if we had more money? And all that sort of drips down into your imagination tank. And so when I decided that we really need to find elderly, enlightened, very, very rich people, multi-billionaires, who have a different perspective on life. They're not just interested in making money anymore. They want to look at their grandchildren in the eyes. I don't want to leave the country in decline, as 81% of the American people in a poll last year think it is. Maybe something can change, because there's such a huge mismatch. Today, for example, we're trying to get some attention to full Medicare for all, the way you have in Canada.
Yes.
Well, there isn't one lobbyist full-time working on that, on Congress, but 2,000 lobbies representing the drug companies and the health insurance companies and the hospital chains. 2,000 to less than one. And that's the mismatch on all these things. So,
well, in fact, the material, and I got to say this as a Canadian, the information that was put out against the anti-healthcare structure in this country in terms of ads on television about Canada is appallingly bad and appallingly wrong.
They have to undermine our view of the Canadian Medicare system, because we always refer to it. This is a 2,000-page bill full of all kinds of ambiguities and attempts to solve problems which you would never have if you had full Medicare for all with free choice of doctor and hospital. And I like to say to members of Congress, do you know how long the Canadian Medicare bill was, the one that covered the entire country? And they say, how long? 13 pages. See, when you cover everybody, you're not worried about exemptions and are you 30 years old to qualify for that, and then what's your age to be denied that. That's what builds up 500, 2,000 pages. And of course, it's going to crash of its own weight. But you see, the point is that you name a major problem in the country, and you'll have the corporations organized to the teeth with lawyers and lobbyists and ads and so on. On the other side, there's just goodwill. I mean, there's just people saying, give us a break. We want a little free, fair play here. So that's what this book's about. What happens if the people in this country are championed by very rich, older people who have important redirections that they want to mobilize the people with? They know it's top-down, bottom-ups, not just top-down. And what if they put billions of dollars in? What if they get mass media? What if they have organizers, a clean elections party, a Congress watchdogs in every district? You know what will happen? We'll turn this country around fast, because there are long overdue changes that Western Europe and often Canada take for granted. I mean, Western Europe, after World War II, devastated. They demanded through their multi-party system and unions and co-ops, universal health care, paid maternity leave, paid family sick leave, paid daycare, good public transit, tuition-free university education, at least 4 weeks paid vacation. This is for all the people. And 64 years later, in the land of the free, home of the brave, USA, we don't have any of these for all the people. So that's why I think enough money behind the public sentiment in this country that is always broke. They don't have the organizers. They don't have the access to the media. Could change. And this could be the most important book I ever wrote, because it shows in detail how to do it, step by step. Once the predicate of super rich people putting the money in with smart strategies, you will not read a page where you can't say, this could really happen.
I want to ask you one last thing, and I want to get you to respond to a quote here from Will Durst, who's a humorist.
Yeah.
So he's saying this as a joke, but I want to get your reaction to it because I think it would be interesting. In talking about you, he said, Ralph Nader fervently believes the truth can affect change. Ralph Nader has yet to learn that the American electorate would rather drink unfiltered haggis juice straight from the tap with their hands tied behind their backs with live copperhead snakes than confront the truth. Do you think that there's an element of truth in what he says, that most people don't want to confront the truth? Or to quote Jack Nicholson, you can't handle the truth?
Well, on some issues, some issues of belief, for example, they don't want to confront evidence or science or technology. But there's a big consensus in this country about fair play. They're really upset about Wall Street, Republican, Democrat. They didn't like the bailouts, for example. Liberals, conservatives don't like corporate subsidies, handouts, giveaways. People who work in Walmart, Republican, Democrat, they think they should get a living wage. Most people think that they shouldn't lose their life savings or die because they can't have health insurance. And whether you're liberal and conservative, you usually like clean air and clean water and safe food. So when you get down to the bottom, the facts of daily life, instead of all these ideological slogans, you get a bigger and bigger consensus. And that's what this book demonstrates. I think it's very dangerous to take the weaknesses of people, or sometimes when they lose their temper and they don't appear to be very alert, and stereotype them, except for humorous purposes, which is what Durst is trying to do. But truth is revolutionary. That's the lesson of history. Truth is revolutionary.
Ralph Nader, I appreciate you doing this. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Good to see you.
Thank you.
Thanks.